recording.
Good.
Yep.
So we are actually doing our first session on the Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes, and this is we're covering a chunk of text.
Yeah.
So if I recall correctly, we are doing chapters 1 through 14.
Well, I mean, we read up to 19.
Oh crap!
Oh.
So I did. Hmm. Okay, so I did 1 through 14,
Okay.
and I will bounce around with the rest later. So a little confusion last time on the schedule because I made a change to it of readings, and that's bled into today. But we'll roll with it.
Okay. I mean, 1 to 14 is fine.
Yeah. So let's just do a little bit of a lead up and summary of sort of the early chapters. But one thing that we should say, we already had a discussion about this that went unrecorded.
Hmm.
So for us, this is a little repeat, but not for the future listener. So we've got Thomas Hobbes. We've just finished before Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. We had just finished Machiavelli's The Prince. Thomas Hobbes dates are 1588 to 1679, so sort of at the this is post Middle Ages, post Renaissance, and we're starting sort of well, I guess you could say that the period of modernity slash the rise of certainly the scientific revolution is occurring around his time,
Hmm.
which will bear out with his method. Um, the the discussion that we had before that we'll sort of be brief about right now is what is he really doing in the opening chapters, right? Because the opening chapters, specifically like 1 through 7 and thereabouts, um, focuses squarely on the human being,
Hmm.
and it's not a discussion of the human being as a political agent, and therefore we can start talking about political theory, but which is sort of the scope of all these discussions. But literally just an analysis of what a human being is and how a human being operates, and what it's made up of. It's sort of a human being's physical fundamental aspects, psychological aspects, speech aspects, and both of us were sort of like, what's the rationale here? What is he doing, right?
Hmm.
Why go into sort of this deep philosophical and quasi scientific reflection on the human being? How does this going to connect with what we know is going to end up being sort of his political theory? So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
On the first 7.
Yeah, or whatever, just sort of the section of man, right?
I
Which
mean,
is
the
actually a
section of
lot.
man is
Well,
all of
we're
what we're
still
talking about
in. Yeah, yeah,
if
you're
we're
right.
going to 14.
That's true. The early section,
Yeah.
like one through 7 ish.
I mean, as I mentioned before off recording, it's a lot of definitions
Hmm.
that kind of, I guess, logically follow one another, and he like
Sure.
reuses the definitions. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how many of the definitions he's going to be reusing at the end, but I think
Yeah.
in in what he's trying to do is he's trying to build up to um, the like to his more political ideologies of like the laws of nature and of how people interface with one another, and he needs to build that up from what people are, and in a way it's kind of similar to what was it, yeah, Aristotle was doing
Hmm. Hmm.
with the politics and the political creature,
Sure.
um,
Exactly.
where he's talking about the individuals and then how they interface with one another.
Yeah. No, that's fair to say, because we. I mean, I guess you can't. We obviously can't talk about politics without talking about humans, right?
Hmm.
Um, So a reflection on the individual does make sense. What I recall, at least with what we read of the politics, Aristotle's politics, is that he jumps in sort of quickly
Yeah.
with announcing that the human being is a political animal.
Yeah.
I
This
mean,
is.
Aristotle does in other works analyze the human, you know, as pure analysis,
Hmm.
but but he gets to that pretty quickly. And then, to be fair, even Plato obviously has certain reflections on the individual, right? Um, because he's making a whole claim that sort of politics is ultimately a matter of character, a matter of something sort of internal to the individual, as well as developing his utopia.
Hmm.
So I mean, I think what you're saying makes sense. And in terms of the definitions, I think you're right on. I did a little bit of secondary reading on Hobbes, and it was talking about, and we discussed this last time off recording, that he's very much into sort of this deductive method based on geometry.
Hmm.
So, in other words, establishing these postulates, and then from that postulate, deductively, you can deduce the next term or the next definition.
Yeah.
Of course, if we had a lot of time and were Hobbesian scholars, we could analyze to what degree um, the one term or the one idea really follows from the other, right?
Hmm.
Which would require a lot of work. I also did, in some of my secondary reading, did come across this idea that not only is he doing this deductive approach, but also certain of his claims actually don't follow the deductive approach, which is interesting, but more sort of his observation of the world. So not only do you have like sort of the deduction from term to term to term, but then he'll sort of veer off that at times and be like, this from what I have observed empirically, right?
Hmm.
This is a truth about the human being. Um, so uh, so yeah, the one thing that sort of shocked us was sort of this approach in the first um, books or chapters that dealt with sort of the human being. I mean, and some of the definitions are very quick too.
Yeah.
You'll get a term, and then a one sentence definition, and it moves on to another term.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, but I had noted that sort of his rationale seems to be he's building from sort of the first elements of human perception and reasoning,
Yep.
and then from that to sort of a picture of human motivation and action. You can sort of see how the human motivation and action is going to become political, because as humans interact, depending on their motivations, you're going to get, well, in his case, war or strife, and then you're going to need to have a solution to it. And then finally, to a deduction of the possible forms of political relations and their relative desirability. So you're going to have, so it's sort of that seems to be sort of the steps that he takes, um, leading up to sort of the heart of his political theory.
Hmm.
Other things we had noted too was his embrace of science. So I said at the beginning that the scientific revolution is sort of happening around this time period. And he is in full embrace of it, specifically a mechanistic view of science. So everything sort of works in this clockwork fashion of sort of, the human being is sort of made up of all of these different sort of, cogs, and they all operate according to, the laws of nature in according to the mechanistic view, a very orderly fashion. And that's going to raise questions that hopefully we'll broach at some point um, about free will. Because if we are all sort of like, if everything is sort of determined through causal relations, to what degree at any particular point do I have freedom? Especially this becomes important when we come together to form a contract,
Hmm.
which is going to be something that is important. Um, Metaphysically, to use the philosophical categories, he is a materialist. That seems to mesh well with a scientific viewpoint. So everything is sort of matter in motion. Um, though he does reference religion a lot, there is a question to what degree he actually believes in the supernatural as a reality,
Hmm.
because most materialists don't. Everything is just atoms in the void, and all talk of supernatural beings or realities um, uh, don't square with that. So that'll be interesting to see. But yeah, materialist, and then his epistemology, um, very much like Aristotle's, an empiricist. So what we know, I mean, other than some of the deductive components, but what we know uh, fundamentally is what we can sense about the world.
Yep. And that's where
So
he starts. Of
yeah,
sense.
exactly. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So I think for yeah, where do you want to go with this? Do you want to get
Um,
into sort of the heart of the politics at this point, or 'cause I'm sort of looking over these early chapters to see what is sort of useful
mm-hmm.
for discussion. Um,
Um, hmm. I mean, he goes over the senses. He goes over imagination,
hmm.
different kind of theories. He goes over like knowledge, the
Right.
various disciplines of knowledge.
Hmm.
Um, and that takes us to like chapter 9. I don't
Right.
know if we need to go into detail anything before that.
Yeah, there's just so much,
Yeah.
in these sections. Let me see. Oh. Yeah, I think probably. I mean, we can refer back if we need to, but you know, I think it really starts to get politically interesting. I think around chapter 13, if I'm correct. Um, I mean, obviously, 12 deals with religion, and there's some interesting uh, topics to discuss there. Um, but yeah, I feel like when he starts talking about the natural condition of man, and ultimately what makes us happy and what makes us miserable, we start to get into, um, and also too, a lot of this has to deal with men or humans interacting, which becomes political, as we said.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I don't know. I feel like we really get some important Hobbesian terms. Um, I found that quote that's sort of really important. So it's on my page 186. I think our pagination is the same.
Yeah.
So it's at the end of the third paragraph. But I can actually read roughly from the middle. It says, well, he first basically talks about um, the um, he talks about a lot of things, but he talks about a condition that humans are in, and he defines it as war. And war is defined, and he repeats this phrase, which is important, is a condition of every man against every man. And basically, the opposite of that would be peace. And then on the middle of 186, I'm quoting, it says, in such a condition, so war, every man is enemy to every man. In such a condition, there is no place for industry. It's a great line, actually, a great quote. Because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious buildings, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And here's the classic line: in the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Hmm.
So, and probably lifespans were even shorter at this time period than they are now, right?
Yeah.
Um, but this, I think, is like sort of an important um, framing of what comes later politically, right? Um, because if humans are finding themselves in this contest, this constant contest, let's say for resources, right? Then there's going to be strife. That's going to affect us psychologically. That'll affect us in terms of whatever power we do or don't have. And out of that is going to basically, it's going to seemingly continue to brew and escalate to the point where there's a breaking point where at least the rational function of us will realize there's got to be a better way. There's got to be something to do about this constant state of war, right?
Hmm.
So it's an interesting, we'll get into contracts later, right? And we'll get into how the social contract should be developed. But this is certainly the starting point. Um, Humans, prior to government, essentially, and prior to a constitution, it's chaos. And while there's a certain amount of actually not a certain amount of freedom, there's total freedom outside of a constitution. You can do whatever you want, Hobbes says, but the catch is you're constantly looking over your shoulder,
Hmm.
and anyone could come in, um, and take you, take your life, take your possessions, take your family, and there would be nothing to adjudicate, or prevent that from happening, because there is no government, there is no police, so on and so forth. So that this is an interesting starting point, especially compared to others. And I guess I would ask you, what do you make of that starting point? Like, does that square with you pretty well? Either like true of deep history, or I mean, could we even deduce that from what we see now? Like, hey, if we didn't have X, Y,
Hmm.
and Z in place, then it would be anarchy. By the way, we should note that um, the mob that ultimately broke into the Capitol occurred just a few days ago from this recording,
This is
and I'm
true.
sure that that will be remembered as. So it's an interesting start to 2021. But anyway,
Yep.
so
Um,
what do you make of that? Because it's going to instantly become political after this.
yeah,
This
I
thinking,
mean, it seems pretty logical. If you remove structure, you're not going to have anything. There's like, if you remove structure, you're not going to have things maintaining order, right? There's this
right,
entropy that drives things to, um, I guess chaos is the word.
right,
Like the natural state of things is not to be in an orderly manner, and that's
yeah,
that's a pretty scientific term as well.
yeah,
Entropy, that is. Yeah, so I think it makes sense. If you were to remove all structure, then uh, either structure would find itself again because people would not like the way that it is,
true,
or it would just be chaos. And I think it's
yeah,
reasonable to argue that structure has been built over time, and it's something that people continue to improve on.
hmm hmm
Well, one thing
I
that's
think it's
interesting
yeah,
is there's this will probably play into it a bit later, but this is kind of reminding me of Machiavelli,
hmm
in that like there's all these things going on. It's all crazy and chaos, and you gotta be watching over your shoulder. Um, and Machiavelli's like, okay, as an individual, let me take advantage of all of the circumstances that I can.
right,
Whereas this will probably, this ends up being kind of different for Hobbes, where it's like, can we have some sort of social contract that puts us all in the best state?
Hmm.
instead of looking out just for one person or one person overall.
Yeah. No, I think that's I think the Machiavellian connection is pretty apt. Um, the I was in one place that I read, there was this one scholar that basically argued that Hobbes is an outgrowth of Machiavelli.
Yeah, I think he even commented on him in one of the chapters. I don't remember which.
Yeah, yeah, actually I don't remember that.
That might have been in
Yeah,
16.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, let's see how. Oh yeah, this is the way this one guy put it. He's a professor of political philosophy. He says, Hobbes, in other words, carried out what Machiavelli had helped him make possible. Machiavelli, remember, claimed to have discovered a new continent, as it were, new modes and orders. It was Hobbes who helped to make this new continent habitable. Um,
Hmm.
Hobbes provided us with the definitive language in which even today we continue to speak about the modern state. So there are these interesting sort of parallels and similarities. And a lot of that sort of fits, because I mean, he does not have a high view of humans, and their ability to sort of, as it were, function on their own without a government, right? And, I,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to think like what would be a possible criticism of this move. Um, and the one way to sort of attack it would be is, does history actually reflect this? And I'm not talking about political conflict, but specifically if he is sort of reconstructing the deep past. So with what we know about sort of Paleolithic cultures, um, and even Neolithic ones, and there's just not any written record, right? But is this true of sort of uh, sort of tribal life pre-civilization and pre-government? So that would be one element, you know. So how much are we projecting our own situation back onto the past? The other thing that sort of um, interests me is human nature, not so much his issue about his analysis of the human in his early chapters, but also this is a pretty like demeaning view. Well, I mean, maybe demeaning is not right, um, but sort of like real minimal view of the human being and their capacity. Now, granted, human beings will later wisen up to develop a contract to create government,
Hmm.
so we can give them a thumbs up there. But in this war, this continual state of war, what does that ultimately say about human nature, right? Um, and that's sort of another way of attacking it. I imagine like post City of God, right? One could say that, given fallen nature, this will happen, right? We've become more self-oriented, selfish, and in so doing that, when selfish people, want the same resources,
Yeah.
they're not going to get along to do it. I mean, I would certainly say in the history of humankind, especially from what we know, right? Um, uh, yeah, I mean, war is a constant state of affairs. And so, I don't know, but I was just sort of thinking, like, what would be one way to sort of attack this step, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it works. Like you mentioned, like we can observe that like those things are going on now, but they might not have necessarily happened in the past. Is that right?
Yeah, what I'm getting at there is that no one knows really how, the earliest human beings operated
Sure.
on
Okay.
this point
Hmm.
because there's no written record. and we just have to extrapolate, right?
Yeah.
Whatever. Are there more arrowheads than there are, I don't know, statues of the gods? And therefore, whatever. Like, it's just not a lot.
Yeah.
And this, when you deal with the social contract theory and you're trying to do a reconstruction of the past, there's a question to whether or not you're really reconstructing it clearly, or is this, you're just like, hey, my God, look at the past 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, look at all this war, look at all this strife, and then you just assume that would be the case for the earliest humans,
Yeah, well,
you
I
know?
think another aspect too is it's not just talking it's not just talking about man to man interactions. I think it's also considering like the worldly environments. Like
Yeah,
um there's a reason man is now the top of the food chain, right? Like if he
hmm,
wasn't before.
yeah,
Um like he would be looking over his shoulder a bunch,
sure.
for
No,
wilder
I
beasts.
imagine.
Um,
Totally,
so so
totally.
that makes sense, and it's like if you have no structure or control over those creatures, then you would be looking over your shoulder, and that would be a fear.
Hmm,
But once
hmm,
you have that control, then you might not need to worry about it anymore, and that's a different kind
yeah.
of control, but it's still there.
No, I think you're right. I mean, my point is, the 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 move that he's making here sits very well with me in terms of like in terms of just whatever, interacting with people, human nature, all of those particular elements. It's just I guess what I just to, to play the devil's advocate so we can actually be thorough on a point. The question that pops in my mind is there are a lot of, I don't want to say assumptions, but there might be some assumptions at play. So, is it the case that human beings seem to be more bellicose and warlike than they are pacific? Hell yeah. But it makes me wonder whether or not, you know, is that our nature, or also, as you were pointing out, environmental considerations that bring about that element. And what does that make for the possible Pacific person, the person that is not bellicose and warlike, right?
Hmm.
I mean, they're there, uh, maybe in the vast minority, and the problem too is that it's hard to find, and now I'm countering the counter. It's just hard to find an absolutely Pacific, peaceful culture. you know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just um, t- it's hard to find, and so it being hard to find, his point seems to hold.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think these. Yeah, I think it's toward the end of the section that we sort of wisen up. So I'm on 188, bottom up, a few lines up. And reason suggests, I won't use the old English, reason suggests convenient articles of peace upon which men may be drawn to agreement. So you have the passions, which he talks about in this chapter, um, that ultimately are going to lead to the conflict. But we are not just, as it were, emotional beings that are driven by our passions. We do have this reasoning component,
Hmm.
and and this is sort of tricky to see how he's going to play this out. But it's thanks to that reason. Like, in other words, like, the tricky part is like, when did this develop historically, right? But thanks to that reason, at least in his reconstruction, that's what enables us to be like, oh, there is another way. There is a way to prevent a continual state of war, seemingly.
Hmm.
So, so I think it's sort of, he's pitting them. We have this binary then of passion versus reason, and the passion by itself. This actually sort of reminds me a little bit of Plato, right? The reasoning component, and then the other two lower components of appetite and spirit, which are not rational.
Yeah.
Um, the I mean, they're using it sort of in different ways, as it were, for different reasons, but it's ultimately reason that's going to lead to peace. And I thought it was interesting too, articles of peace. Later, we're going to be reading the Articles of Confederation, first developed by the early colonies in America. So it's sort of like this has got to be um, sort of well we get this later, at least in what I read. It needs to be sort of written, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
But it can't be mere words, which is a Hobbesian thing, right? It can't
Mm,
just be a contract written up with nothing behind it to enforce it.
yeah, yep.
So this is another great line too. Um, the so still in 188, but a little bit higher, first paragraph break. He says, "To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of the notions of right and wrong, justice and justice have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues."
Hmm.
And as we mentioned before, um, on our off recording, is he seems to be a bit of an ethical relativist, especially in that statement, right? No notions of right or wrong in a state of nature prior to the contract.
Yep.
You can do whatever you want,
Yep.
and no one can say that's right or wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't think that this would sit well with someone that believes right and wrong are sort of real categories, regardless of what humans are doing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
No,
sort of
that's
like the sort
fair.
of like the divine notion. Like it's like God made the Ten Commandments, and these are binding and real, regardless of whether or not humans are living in government or not. These are, and regardless of whether or not a human group even recognizes the Ten Commandments or something like that, because these are, I mean, some theorists like Aquinas would say that they're sort of written on your heart. They're in you.
Sure.
Um, so, and he actually gets at a little. It's actually interesting. He does a spin on natural law theory. So that Aquinas, who I just mentioned, has this natural law theory where basically, God sets up the world in such a way that morality is absolute. It is real. We we can tap into it. We can know this through divine revelation, um, the Bible, and reading what those rules are. But also, if you never had that, if you grew up in isolation or something like that, you would know it in your heart. You would know, like your conscience, as he sees it, would tell you that ultimately, if you thought about it, murder is wrong, not because you read it in the Ten Commandments, but because it's written in you. And that's sort of a very Thomistic Aquinas theory. I think a lot of Christians would hold to a version of that, but he has a natural law theory too, but it's different. The natural law. I'm trying to reconstruct without looking right now, but the natural law to him is essentially, I think it's like pursuing what you desire or what's going to bring you happiness. You
Of
know what that?
Aquinas or
No, Hobbes man.
of Hobbes?
Yeah, Hobbes has his own law of nature. This would be or natural law theory.
Uh,
Um,
would this be what we were
oh,
reading in chapter
oh, oh,
14?
yeah. It would be essentially like I think it's self-preservation. That's what his
Yeah.
natural law is.
Mm-hmm.
So he has a natural law theory, but it's much more minimalist, right? Preserve your life than the natural law theory that Thomas Aquinas has, which is much more robust. Um, like they're more you have and also like a moral flavor to it.
Right.
Whereas the self-preservation, you could see something being moral there, right? You could say if you have self-preservation, then you shouldn't take your life. That's a moral component. But he has sort of his own version of a natural law theory.
Yeah. So I mean, from that, it sounds like you said Aquinas, right?
Aquinas, yeah,
It sounds
Aquinas.
like Aquinas's ethics are more virtue based,
Yeah, they would be.
and
The,
Hobbes would be more. shoot, what's the word? Not Kantian, not virtue. What's the
Utilitarian.
utilitarian? Thank you.
Yeah,
Would be more
yeah.
utilitarian.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And
And their utility only, well, let's put it this way. The utility of the law of nature, I'm looking at it right now, where he first mentions it in 14, middle of, and he says, yeah, I'm sorry. A law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or taking away the means of preserving the same. Boom.
mhm.
So with his, it's almost like it's basically survival, right?
Yeah.
For Hobbes,
Mhm.
but for Aquinas, man, yeah, it would be like all the cardinal virtues. It would be all of Aristotle's virtues, and they're all according to natural Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory. You can discover them within yourself. They're in you. God
Yeah.
sort of like wove them into you. I guess you can play out being made in the image of God. They are in you, and that we don't have with Hobbes.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's interesting because this it's almost like Hobbes's analysis allows for any other to fit its place
Hmm.
because it has um because without contract essentially there is no, like he's saying, there is no right or wrong, there is no justice or
Hmm.
injustice. So I feel like you could argue that any of the other um, ideologies would be contracts, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
Aquinas's would be a
Sure.
contract.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Whether or not you believe it comes from, from within one's own conscious or heart, that doesn't necessarily. Um, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it feel like it has, it's just a different origin than being on paper, right?
Yeah, I totally. I mean, if he is like a hardcore materialist and an atheist, let's just say he is, and all the talk of like religion has more of a political, mundane function as
Hmm.
opposed to a spiritual one, then I think you're right. He would be like, okay, fine, whatever. This group over here uh, formed a contract. Part of their contract that they're forming has this Thomistic, which is basically the adjective for Aquinas, this Thomistic um, set of virtues. Well, that's fine. That's what you've contracted to do, you know,
Yeah.
right? If that's a piece of it, you know. So I think, yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. You could all sort of ethical theories then, which are not grounded metaphysically in reality, but just made up by humans, could be a part and parcel of your contract when you develop it.
Right. And that's not to say
I can
that
see
there
that.
aren't similarities between all contracts that you might be able to consider or find.
Hmm.
Um, that would be like, oh, it's a human thing, or
Right.
it's normal for humans to react in these ways or have those feelings.
Hmm.
But it's I mean it's almost a cop out too. It's like,
Yeah.
well, we can just say, there's no rules, there's no right or wrong, until you observe that there's a right or wrong, or you come up with one.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a weird juxtaposition
Yeah.
there.
It does seem interesting. So I misspoke when I said that. I mean, it still is minimalist. His law of nature, right, which is self-preservation. But in 190, he does add to it, and that is the peace component. So it's not just self-preservation, and maybe he's doing a little deductive element here. But if we tease out that law of nature of self-preservation, this is the italicized part
Yep.
uh, toward
I
the top
see.
of
Yeah, I know.
190. Yeah, that the whatever, and consequently, it is a precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. And then he puts it in sum, the first branch of which rule containeth the first and fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. So I can see these are sort of almost two sides of the same coin. right? If I am trying to do self-preservation, um, which, whatever is this law of nature, and then I start to reflect on it. Well, living in a condition of perpetual war is not going to lead to self-preservation for any member,
Yeah.
right? But peace will, right? Peace, the absence of war, it's the absence of the strife, will actually support that preservation for myself, for you, and for others, right? And those I think, um, uh, yeah, those I think are also an important move, right? Because we've got, here's the condition that you live in. Here are, um, uh, the laws of nature, as it were, that you can, or, that should prompt your next move politically, let's say. And how do we ultimately accomplish peace and self-preservation? It's going to be through developing a contract of some sort and having it enforced.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, um, so having read the next few chapters,
Yeah,
there are
sorry.
actually 19 laws that he has,
Oh,
and
nice.
only two
I
are
I
in
have
chapter
I have
14.
doubly misspoken.
So he lists kind of the two, I guess, most prominent ones in this chapter, but in chapter 15 he goes over the remaining 17,
Ah, I see that. I see that.
and
Well, it's Hobbes. He
it's
can't just do two.
you're right. But I
Right.
think
Can
uh,
you summarize those? I mean, you don't have to. We don't have to go into detail. But what was sort of the flavor of those? Having not
um,
read that.
okay, so a lot of them have to do with contracts and
Ah.
like yeah, you know, who has the right to a contract and
Hmm.
the dealings between parties
Okay.
who make those contracts.
Okay. So it's basically laws of nature related to contracts.
Yeah, for yes.
Okay. Okay.
There are
Now I
also
think
there
we
are also
should
some other
go.
weird ones. Or I say weird, but just in the context, it's like
Yeah.
for modesty and warning against arrogance and things like that.
Right. But I guess part of that would be important because, um, whatever. Let's say, for instance, there needs to be a certain amount of humility when going into the contract to keep it fair, something like,
Yeah.
or to keep it, yeah, well, to keep it fair, so you're not just sort of like, I'm getting the most out of this contract, right? But we're getting an equal share of
Hmm.
this. Now, what I do think is interesting is that, so back to 14, is that we've already mentioned that Hobbes says that when man is in a state of nature, he is absolutely free. He can do absolutely anything.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think
Um,
the term he used was that's the human right, right?
yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And then what's interesting though is that, right, what's in this, it's sort of in this, section, is, so you have absolute freedom, but what's happening here is that in so going into the contract, the rationale being what we've already mentioned, that you don't want to live in a perpetual state of war and fear and have this nasty, brutish, short life, that you now are giving up that some of that freedom.
Yep.
So because the contract's ultimately going to say, I mean, let's just say something very simple, that you can't commit murder,
Hmm.
right? Self killing for self-defense may be allowable, right? But you just can't straight out murder somebody. Um, so you could do that in a state of nature, but in the contracted state, you can't. So it's sort of this interesting element of total, like, that's the catch. You are giving up some of your freedom, which is true of the modern state, right? I mean, I could do whatever I wanted to do, but there are going to be repercussions,
Yeah. Hmm.
and there's going to be fines. There'll be jail time. There'll be a record. The record will keep me from, voting, getting a good job, all that stuff. So those are all in place to curb you know, bad behavior, or if you will, to put it in contractual language, illegal behavior, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
what's very interesting about that is we'll get into this next time, but all of that requires like a third party that what he ends up calling the sovereign.
yes, yes, and this that much I know about Hobbes without having read some of the chapters that you have.
Hmm.
That yes, the I mean, we're going to get a particular political model. I
Yeah.
mean, it's going to be monarchy,
Yep.
and 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 it's interesting because you're, in a sense, you're actually, if I remember the language, and you can comment on it, but you're actually giving up. So whatever, let's say I have 100% liberty, and now I'm down to 50%. You're actually giving that 50% liberty that you're losing to the sovereign.
Yeah.
There's sort of a transfer.
And they're
Um,
like the arbiter of all contracts.
yes, exactly. Because he's already hinting at it, where in sort of these, well, yeah, like in the one part that I read on 188, he's like, where there is no common power, there is no law.
Hmm.
So you've got to have, and then also too, maybe it's in this section. Yeah, because he starts talking about contracts
He does
in
start talking
14.
about the contracts, yes.
Yeah, in 14, that as I mentioned before, um, well, I'll read it because I have it underlined on 194 top up. He says, words alone are an insufficient sign of a free gift and therefore not obligatory. So, in other words, now he's talking about, I think in this context, giving, right?
Hmm.
But still, from that, words alone are not obligatory. There's nothing to enforce it, you know. So if you and I, created a contract and there wasn't this third party, let's put it this way: there weren't repercussions, right? If we didn't hold up our end of the bargain, then why would I do it? You
Right.
know, the only thing that would be curbing your behavior in that case would be something like reputation, right? Future contracts, people might not be, likely to engage in a contract with me. I don't know, if you were playing a platonic card, possibly um, becoming vicious internally, right? But um, but in terms of like the Hobbesian analysis, yeah, you have to have basically a strong man with a lot of power. I mean, maybe we can say absolute power, right? That is the enforcer of the contract, and with X, Y, and Z repercussions if it's not upheld. You
Yeah.
know,
Hmm. Yeah, and in
it'll be
chapter
interesting.
18
Yeah.
it goes over I don't know if they're called laws, but it lists a bunch of points about
Hmm.
the sovereign and like
Hmm.
how they can be treated and how that contract kind of works because
Hmm.
essentially everyone needs to agree on the same contract and they are giving up like the sovereign is that contract that they're
Yeah.
agreeing on. And the sovereign can be any type of government. Like it can be a body of people. It could be an individual. I think he advocates for monarchy definitely.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but yeah,
So you've got the power component, but then he also adds the fear component, right?
hmm.
This is 198. He's like, covenants entered into by fear in the condition of mere nature are obligatory. Um, so I feel like that's another component, right? Only it's the kind of fear that will be productive, as opposed to the fear in the state of nature, which is destructive,
Hmm.
right? Because I mean, it just, I mean, imagine living in a continuous state of fear, in a state of nature. You have no idea what's going to happen next. But at least you've got this type of fear, which seems to be part of the foundation of the contract, is it's useful. To go back to your sort of utilitarian note,
Hmm.
it's useful to get you to abide by it.
Yeah, and it's predictable.
Yeah, yeah. Now that is roughly where I ended because I didn't get into the chapters we did. God knows why, but
I
but
might
I
have
think that.
misread what
No,
we were
I
supposed
well, I
to
might
read,
have as
but
well. But I think you've got. I really like this section that we covered in the bulk of this conversation.
hmm
It's there's a lot of food for thought. There are a lot of questions that are raised, um, and it's what is interesting as well is it reflects a lot of what we know of modern politics. You know,
yeah,
we're going to end up getting a constitution ultimately in our reading, and most, from what I know, uh, fully developed first world countries have some type of constitution.
hmm
It's written down, and then there's a force behind it, which you could probably say would be the leadership, whatever format it has, the military, right, the police, to enforce. Oh, I'm sorry, and also a judicial system to enforce this
probably the
particular
most important
contract. Yeah, exactly.
for
So
this. Yeah,
it's very attractive as a theory in terms of what we know about modern politics.
yeah. I'm part of me wonders how much of it was reflective and how much of it was projective.
Sure.
Do you
What's
know?
interest what well what I do know, so I don't know what, as it were, what constitution was going on, let's say, in England during his time. I don't know. It's a thing to research. But I do know that the social contract theory ends up getting carried on by Rousseau, and unfortunately we couldn't squeeze his book in, um, and also John Locke, who we will read,
hmm
um, and that the founding fathers were essentially social contract theorists. So
Okay.
so is it to so obviously they could be, because they're 1700s, right? The founding fathers, so they can look back at this tradition of a social contract theory. But what I mean, I don't like. I know that I don't know. I know that there were laws, you know, in Rome.
hmm
There were laws in Greece, but I don't know. I don't know that there was a constitution that was explicitly written out. And I don't know, like reading Machiavelli, it seemed like it was up to the whim of the prince,
Right.
right? Without sort of a constitution that's forcing him to behave in certain ways. Yeah, yeah, you can lead and you've got this much freedom. However, you can't do X, Y, and Z because we have all this written out. I don't know. I don't
hmm
know. And it's worth looking into. I know that in the English tradition, and we'll get this at least in one of the Supreme Court cases that we read, Roe v. Wade, which is really interesting read. They go back to what's called English common law. They do this very sort of historical genealogical study of abortion. It's an amazing text,
hmm
seriously, regardless of what one thinks about the conclusions, just how they go about sort of developing the argument. So there is this thing called the English common law, not theory, but there is English common law. I don't know when that starts. I don't know if that's in the Middle Ages. I don't know if that's around the time of Hobbes or thereafter. But I would say this: this would be an example of theory changing the world if he is sort of one of the originators of the idea of a constitution.
hmm
You know, so good,
Yeah.
good talk
Good
always,
talk.
Chris.